So now I have the pleasure to introduce a colleague from The Guardian. Blake Montgomery is the technology editor of The Guardian US and a journalist who has covered the tech industry for much of his career, and he will be moderating a fireside chat with FCC Chair Jessica Rosenworcel. Blake, are you in here? Hi.
Hello. Hi. If everyone could give a welcome to the chairwoman of the FCC. And today's event is about misinformation, so I'm curious to start off if you've ever fallen for a piece of misinformation. I thought Noam Chomsky was dead last week. He's not.
Yeah, I can't confirm or deny that.
Fair enough. So I am very curious. You've made a lot of announcements in recent months about the dangers of AI-generated misinformation, especially in the wake of the infamous Biden robocall. So I'm curious what you think the most important thing that the public should know about the dangers of that type of misinformation is.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you to Open Markets for having me here today. It's my first time at one of your events, so I'm really pleased to be here. And I appreciate that you started with that. It was back in February that a whole bunch of people in New Hampshire got a phone call from the president.
Or did they?
Or someone who sounded like the president, passing along information about where to vote and when that was totally inaccurate just in advance of the state primary. So when we learned this, we kicked into gear pretty fast at the Federal Communications Commission. On a bipartisan basis, my colleagues and I issued a declaratory ruling that pre-recorded artificial voices using AI cloning technology violate the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. And then we partnered with the Attorney General of New Hampshire to figure out where that call came from and who carried the traffic. And as a result, within about 2 weeks, we had identified the individual, we identified the carrier responsible, we find them, we shut them down, and our colleagues in New Hampshire use their state criminal authorities to start prosecution. So we had an early, clear signal, a shot across the bow that we had, saying, you do this, we'll find you. Now, the challenge, of course, is that this technology is cheap and easy, and we should expect that it shows up again in the future. But we wanted to use the tools we have at the Federal Communications Commission to set up some early signs that this is problematic and it violates the law, because we know that kind of false information about where to vote and false information about when to vote is really destructive to our democracy.
In what role, you mentioned you got in touch with the carrier that was involved, what role do you see telecommunications companies playing in the prevention of the spread of that type of misinformation? I think more of Facebook and Google as playing an active role in policing misinformation more so than AT&T or Verizon.
So in this case, we had an individual responsible for putting these calls on the network and a carrier who took them without engaging in any of the call authentication that is required under our rules. So that's a sign that something shady's going on. And we decided to hold them to account. And they're now facing a $2 million fine as a result. And we told all other carriers in the United States to not carry their traffic. So the effort here is to say to carriers themselves that if you put this junk on the line, we're going to figure out where you did it, when you did it, and tell other carriers not to take it.
And you made an announcement this morning related to that now.
Well, recognizing we're going to face more of this in the future, I thought it was incumbent on us to actually write all the major carriers in the country and say, we know you have a lot of practices that are underway to stop robocalls. We need more of them. We need updated laws, and we need new technologies. But why don't you tell us what you're doing? Because we want to look to make sure that carriers are all using the best practices that are available, the best technologies that are available, and be able to understand what a baseline looks like in the United States. I think that a lot of that work is going on behind closed doors, and I think it's an opportunity to speak about it a little more in public. I think we're going to need that.
Has there been any response yet? I know it was this, 2 hours ago?
Yeah, I think it was 2 hours ago, so I think we're still waiting on a response. But I'm convinced that we're going to have to spend more energy and effort tracking down AI voice cloning robocalls than we have in the past, because like I said before, this technology is cheap and easy, and the laws we have governing it are old and not fully built for the moment we're in.
What should change about the laws?
Oh, many things. First of all, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act is the primary law that governs robocalls. It's from 1991. In 1991, I had an AOL account, was very proud of it.
I was going to say, did they have robocalls in 1991?
Well, they had these phones that had jacks in the wall with these curly cords I have to explain to the young people in my office. It was a long time ago. So just imagine that Congress created that framework back in 1991, and it spoke to technology in 1991. So much has changed. Every single person here has a phone in their pocket or purse, and if they don't, you're probably not listening to me right now. You're wondering where you left it.
Or someone's taking a picture of us with an iPad.
Yeah. And so as a result, we're going to need some updates to that law. There's some deficiencies in there regarding how we can actually prosecute the bad actors responsible for robocalls, and also some technological adjustments, like with respect to the definition of autodialer.
What, the definition of autodialer?
All right, we're getting into the weeds. All right.
Well, speaking of changes to the law, something that I'm curious about is there's a growing, I would say, faction within telecommunications law, technology law, that believes that Google and Facebook should be classified as in the bucket of common carriers, so perhaps under the authority of the FCC. So
common carrier is well, we have a long history with common carriage, as everyone here knows, which is that you have an entity that offers services to the public and has to take all comers. It is a very important part of our legal and historical tradition. Our oversight of common carriers is really limited to communications providers, and those are defined as telecommunications carriers that offer communications from point A to point B for a fee to the public. So those are traditional infrastructure providers. But if you think about it, we've really used that authority over time to come up with some really profoundly important things that involve communications in the United States. Like, for instance, you can pick up the phone and you can call anyone, and your phone company can't cut you off and decide you shouldn't be calling that person at this time of day. They can't decide that they're going to edit the content of your conversation. You have a right to be able to call who you want when you want. And so something we recently did at the Federal Communications Commission is we expanded that concept to the broadband era and internet access, because we reinstated net neutrality, which basically says you should be able to go online, go where you want without your broadband provider shutting off access to websites or particular content because they don't like it or don't have a commercial relationship with them. So those principles have long informed communications policy, and in our context, I think they're important and they're positive and good for consumers.
And so should Google and Facebook be considered the same?
I think that's good. It doesn't fit neatly in the Communications Act, so that's one of those things that I think Congress is going to have to think about. But it's a conversation that I think we should be having.
I'm sure that Google and Facebook would not love to be under the authority of a new federal agency. And as the election gets closer, I'm curious how your agency is going to be navigating the transition to a potential Trump administration. It's not a secret that you and the president's predecessor have different ideas.
Yeah, not a secret. Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately with respect to artificial intelligence is its use in advertising, and particularly political advertising. Again, building on the tradition, precedent, and history at the Federal Communications Commission, we have, since the 1930s, required that political advertisements get recorded in files. Who bought it, what they paid for it, and when it ran. And so television stations and radio stations all have to keep those files. And it's a really important tool for transparency and public disclosure. So I have proposed to my colleagues that in addition to those things, we should contemplate having an indication about whether or not AI was used in the production of that political advertisement. It's building on a system that's been around for decades, and I think it's ultimately about transparency. You, the viewer, the listener, the voter, you get to decide, but I can say whether or not that technology has been used and create a public record disclosing that. So I've put that in front of my colleagues, and it's a proposal that I'd like to see us get some public comment on so we can move forward.
Do you find that the dangers of AI, we've seen some kind of misinformation target the Olympics, for example, and I'm curious if you see the dangers of AI-generated misinformation to be more coming from the domestic sphere or the foreign sphere?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like we're going to have to leave that one for the researchers. But I think it is important at a minimum that we develop a baseline for transparency. Say when you use it. That's the proposal we've got going forward, and I think that's going to be where we start.
And making it incumbent on the advertiser themselves in the case of the political ads.
That's historically been exactly how we've done it. So this is building on a system that has been around. And by the way, it applies to federal elections, state elections, local elections, and issue campaigns.
Are any of the AI detectors good enough to pass muster for if your agency was undertaking an investigation into whether AI was used? Are any of the detectors good enough?
Well, the legal issue would be whether or not they disclosed it. And so I think first things first, it would be an issue of disclosure and compliance with the public file requirements of the FCC. I think what you're describing is down the road, and I got some confidence that we're going to have to use some technology down the road to understand these things all across the economy, and it's not just an issue for the FCC.
Is the FCC using generative AI in any of its own operations?
Well, one of the ways that we're looking at artificial intelligence right now that I'm actually quite excited about is with dynamic access to spectrum and airwaves. Most of us never really think about how our phones work, but I think about it all the time. I think about which bands are, making it possible for us to get internet access in our pockets, and how to make sure that that activity doesn't interfere with television broadcasting and your garage door opener. Making that system work well is really important. But the allocation systems that we as the government have had over time for this aren't super precise. We allocate some airwaves for some purposes, some for others. Some are used all the time, some are used only occasionally. It feels to me that there's an opportunity to take the airwaves that we think of scarce and make them more dynamically available. So if one system's not using airwaves, maybe they could be used for another purpose. And those dynamic spectrum access systems are possible today. We've got to get much more creative about using them. And I think artificial intelligence and machine learning, which can develop pattern recognition at extraordinary scale, could be an incredible tool for that. And I've done some work with the National Science Foundation to try to bring forward this idea. In a world where we always talk about artificial intelligence and we sort of cue the hand-wringing, this is actually a positive idea. And I think it's one of those areas that we should be investing in the United States, because I think we could really lead when it comes to this technology.
Could be very exciting. Do you have a favorite spectrum, part of the broadband spectrum?
I do. Oh my God, I appreciate the nerd opportunities here. We created a hierarchy of spectrum rights in the 3.5 gigahertz band that is really world-changing.
How thrilling.
And it is. Well, it's an example of what I was talking about, right? We used to allocate that just to the Defense Department, and the Navy used it for radars on the coasts. Oh, there's a lot of territory in the middle of the United States that might be able to use that band. And they only use it occasionally on ships. So we created a secondary right for wireless companies to purchase those licenses. And then to the extent the wireless companies weren't using it, we created a tertiary right to make sure that anyone could use it for free for Wi-Fi. It's a system where you create abundance out of airwaves that have historically been thought of being scarce, that I think is really creative. And we've led the charge on that in the United States and at the Federal Communications Commission, and I'm proud of it, which is why it's my favorite. You didn't see that coming, did you?
No, honestly, it was sort of a joke, but that's a really interesting answer. I mean, speaking of airwaves, I'm curious, the FCC, actually one of your staff described the FCC as the DMV for satellites, which is a great descriptor, I have to say.
I am going to go back to my office and figure out who said that.
Oh, I can't tell you. I can't reveal my sources.
Because when I waited for a license at the DMV, it took an awful long time. So,
yeah, it's not, yeah. I think he said it was
all right.
not
Some limits
favorable.
to that analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I am curious, I mean, your agency is the one that has purview over Starlink, which is this growing enormous power kind of under the direction of one of tech's most erratic billionaires. And I'm curious if there's anything more that you want to do to regulate that power or let it keep expanding.
So one of the challenges with terrestrial networks are there are some places where it's really costly to build them.
The Amazon rainforest.
Yeah, or parts of our national parks. And yet it would be safer if we had those communications available to everyone, no matter where they go and what they do. It would be safer in a world with climate change where we had a backup in our skies when terrestrial networks burn down or are affected by weather events or disaster. So what we really want to do over time is integrate the wireless terrestrial networks we have with the phones in our pockets with those that are in our skies, and figure out how to have a single network future that combines all of these services so that they're always functional. It'll be revelatory, not just here in the United States, but for the 2.6 billion people worldwide who don't have access to the internet today. But if we're going to do this effectively, we're going to need more competition in our skies, and particularly in low Earth orbit. We are leading the world with low Earth orbit satellites. But I think we can be more creative and more active if we ensure that there are other constellations that are sharing this opportunity.
Other constellations is a great way to phrase it. And yesterday there was a ruling out of the Supreme Court. I know your agency doesn't regulate content, but I am curious what your take of whether you believe the Supreme Court was right in saying that there was no standing for the plaintiff in the Murphy v. Missouri case about misinformation.
Yeah, like you said, it's not something that intersects with the work of the FCC, and I dutifully looked it up, saw it was 68 pages, and decided I'm going to take a beat and read it this weekend. That being said,
some light beach reading.
In my world, it does. Anyway, but as I understood, it was dismissed on standing grounds, and that they were seeking a really sweeping injunction. Ultimately, there needs to be the possibility for communication back and forth about issues that affect the safety and security of the American people. So this ruling seems on point to me.
And what do you make of there's another SCOTUS case coming down, Net Choice v. Paxton. I'm curious where you fall on which side of the Texas law.
Oh, you see, the way the calendar works, I think we're going to get that decision out tomorrow.
Probably.
Yeah.
I'm nervous.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, a pity every Supreme Court reporter. You're going to be busy tomorrow. In any event, I think I'm going to hold my powder until I actually read what the court comes up with that. It's complicated, and it's complicated trying to simultaneously understand Section 230, where there are neutral vessels for content, and this set of cases where they are prioritizing their ability to moderate and editorialize by making choices about content. So you can see the evolving state of these technology platforms in our law, and it is changing in real time.
We will see. And speaking of kind of similar laws, there's one coming down in California that just is passing in the legislature, the California Journalism Act, that may make it so that social media companies would pay for carriage of news. I'm curious, do you think that is a way to solve the struggles of local journalism and its funding? Is it we might end up like Canada and Australia where they don't carry news at all? Curious what your opinion would be on that.
So I think the important thing to recognize is that journalism is the only private sector activity that is called out in our Constitution. We all need the kind of facts that journalism develops to make decisions about our lives, our communities, and our country. It's that important. And if you look back even at the founding of the Republic, we have made policy choices to try to support local journalism. For instance, it's long been the case that postal rates for periodicals are less than they are for other kinds of mail. I know that there's other laws that have been proposed here in Washington, like the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, that would change the tax code with respect to the hiring of journalists and the ordering of local papers by consumers. I know at the FCC, one of the things that we've done is we have proposed changes to station licensing. So many people in the United States get their local news now from television and radio. So what I did was propose that if you have the capacity for local origination at a television or radio station, we'll give you first-in-class opportunities for license renewal. So you've got the capability to produce local content. We're going to make sure that you can speed through that process, go to the head of the line. That's a model that's based off a law called the Children's Television Act, and I think it all passes constitutional muster. But it's a demonstration of how we can make choices that help support journalism, because we really need it for a functioning democracy.
I would agree. I would also like to keep my job. And also, speaking of broadcasters and bringing it back to something we talked about at the beginning, are you reaching out to broadcasters about AI, about the dangers of and what they'll have to do if there are AI ads marked with made with AI, or will they have to do anything?
I think we're still in early days. What I've done is propose that we take this system we've long had for political ads and just make sure that there is an indication about whether or not AI was used in the advertisement. It's very simple. It passes First Amendment muster, and it allows the viewer to make decisions about the content. You don't want the government making those decisions about the content. You want to leave that in the hands of the viewer and the citizen. And so I think what we've proposed with political advertisements is consistent with that. And I hope it's a baseline that we can get out there, because I think as citizens we should expect that people disclose when this technology is used.
And is your agency in touch with any of the kind of big AI companies? What is your interface with those? Your Microsofts, OpenAIs, Anthropics?
To some extent, some of it's limited. A lot of it has been in the context of those spectrum policy issues that I've described, which is really a discrete use case for this technology. I think that across the board, though, since the executive order from the president, there's just been a lot of back and forth in different parts of the government, and I know that we've been part of some of those conversations, but not all of them.
No, I imagine it's not kind of the most immediate thing that the AI companies have to deal with yet. But I am kind of running out of questions. You've answered all of them quite quickly. But I am curious, like, have you used AI yourself? Do you use it often, or?
You know, I think one of the things I always tell people in my office is every new technology, consider putting it on your phone or using it. Don't be someone who works in this field in any capacity without being someone who tries it. I think that your personal experiences can help inform what you think about these technologies, and you shouldn't only talk about them as an academic or in the abstract. You should engage and use them. So I try to be an early adopter with a lot of them, and am constantly tooling around and exploring. Sometimes you find it's a lot easier to ask a quick question with the AI systems, and sometimes you also find that if you want an answer, it builds it out of fraudulent and fake stuff. So I think we've got a lot of room for improvement with these models, but I just think that everyone should try to engage with them, understand what's happening, understand their strengths, their weaknesses, and if you're going to work in technology policy, try to be an early adopter yourself.
That's good advice. Do you see them as threats to democracy or creating grand ones? I guess we've talked about the misinformation component of it.
I do think that they create an endless group of legal questions that we're going to have to start taking a close look at about intent and responsibility that I don't think we have a full handle on. I think they create a lot of questions about how we're going to compensate those whose data and facts they take to inform these models. But I think it's also important that we start to identify these discrete use cases where it might be positive. And I think, like I mentioned with spectrum policy, that's a good example of one. And even when you come down with robocalls, part of me thinks the more that we can use autonomous systems to start identifying traffic patterns and find junk before it reaches you at home, that's a positive use case. We've actually started an inquiry on that too. And so I am not one of those people who thinks that we have to give in to doomerism on this at every juncture. I think we got to try identifying some places where we can make this technology work for us, and we got to be aggressive about doing that.
What's the object of the inquiry that you guys have started, or what do you hope to find?
Well, if you think about communications, it's just an endless stream of traffic over many pieces of communications networks. And a lot of that traffic flows with a certain amount of authentication. We know where it came from and who was responsible for it. But the more that we can automate systems to identify the traffic that fails those tests and identify where it came from, see patterns in it, the more we'll be able to stop junk calls from ever reaching you on the phone. You see some of that today with some authentications technologies like stir-shaken. That's the technology that's on the IP portion of our networks and leads to you occasionally getting a call that says spam risk on it.
Do you get those?
Of course I do. We all do. But
Now-
but that's an early indication of the kind of technologies we might be able to use at much broader scale. And if we could do that, again, we'd be taking this new technology and trying to find ways to use it for good. And I feel people who are public-spirited and public-minded need to go wrestle with these technologies and try to identify those kind of use cases.
We're almost out of time, but what could the FCC be doing on spam calls to further prevent them? I mean, it's one of when I talk to our readers, that is one thing that they kind of continually bring up as a pain point with technology. They're not worried about Facebook moderation.
Absolutely. I think the primary challenge for us is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act is, like I said, from 1991, from the early AOL days. And I think we badly need an update in Congress to identify new tools and new ways to go after the bad actors who put this junk on the line. Because it's not just creating inconveniences, it's also often the start of fraud. And it has a destructive power when it comes to trust in the very communications networks we all have to rely on. So new laws, and I got lots of ideas about those, but and making sure that we should, on a bipartisan basis, make it a priority to stop this junk.
Got it. Well, thank you for joining us. I think we are out of time. But thank you so much for joining us, Chairwoman.
Thank you.